Hello, I'm Hindol Sengupta. I'm absolutely delighted today to welcome in conversation with me Mohammad Soliman. Let me read out all the wonderful things Mohammad does so that you get a full picture of all his wonderful achievements. Mohammad Soliman is the director of the Strategic and Emerging Technologies in the Middle East Institute, the MEI. The primary focus of his work has been to understand the intersection of technology and geopolitics in the Middle East. He has many accolades to his name, among them the Open Society Foundation Civil Society Leadership Award in 2017, and also the US National Security and Foreign Affairs Leadership List. He was part of this list in 2021. I'm going to talk to Mohammed about a whole bunch of things, including the partnership between India and the Middle East, and also a very unique framework he's developed. It's called the Indo-Abrahamic framework. Mohammed, let's begin from that point. Tell us a little more about this, because, of course, it involves India, Israel, and the UAE, all three partners increasingly becoming closer. Tell us a little bit more about this Indo-Abrahamic framework. What do you mean by that?
First of all, thank you so much for having me on your show. Really appreciate the work you do. I always enjoy engaging with Indian intellectuals. The Indo-Abrahamic framework, for me, means alignment between West Asian powers, India, moderate Arab states, and Israel. And for me, this is more of codifying existing strong bilateral relations that are based on security ties, trade ties, people-to-people ties that have been taking place in the last 20 years specifically. And for me, this framework is not really a new thing. This is more of a reflection of history. These relations have existed back in the 12th century, 13th century. But then the moment we had British colonialism and European colonialism, some of these dynamic relations have been cut down because of the British Empire. And what we're trying to do, or what the Indo-Abrahamic framework is about, is rebuilding these sort of ties today on much more mutual interest basis.
The other question that I wanted to really talk to you about, Mohammed, is, of course, in this framework of yours, the Indo-Abrahamic framework, there are two or three key things. India and Israel have never been closer in their entire history. India and the UAE have never been closer. And of course, India and Israel and the UAE signed historic peace negotiations and in a sense, have never been closer, right? So India and Israel have never been closer. India and the UAE have never been closer. And the UAE and Israel have never been closer. What's really happening in the UAE and what's really happening in the Middle East?
This is a very excellent question. I think there are two components to my answer here. There is the big picture answer, and there is the regional answer. The big picture answer is we have a dysfunctional global order. That's it. And this means you have age of minilateralism, that countries are much more willing to work in trilateral or quadrilateral formats on issue-based alignment. So we end up with Quad, India, Japan, the United States, and Australia focusing more on the Indo-Pacific, or AUKUS, Australia, UK, and US. Or you have the France, India, UAE trilateral. So you start to have these sort of trilaterals are foundational to maintaining a stability and balance of power in certain sub-regions around the world. So this is the bigger picture. On the regional level, it's very similar. It's countries believing that there's no geopolitical balanced system in West Asia, or West Asia, in my own definition, is the convergence between South Asia and the Middle East. So countries want to work together on trilateral or quadrilateral formats with the objective of building balance of power. This is why, in my viewpoint, the I2U2 is very important, very consequential, because it's the start of this mechanism to integrate West Asian powers together in some sort of positive framework. And the future of the I2U2 would be much more fluid today, but I think this is the vehicle that we should focus on.
There are questions being asked about the UAE and Saudi Arabia. both countries seem to be moving towards, for the lack of a better word, a more open society. Can you explain to us what's really happening? The Abraham Accords, of course, triggered a whole new sort of dimension of peacemaking in the Middle East. But individually, these countries too seem to be consistently pushing the boundaries today of trying to become more open societies. What's happening in the Middle East that the world is not understanding, Mohammed? What really is going on?
As someone who has multiple hats and lived between multiple cities at the same time, um, the Western imagination about the Middle East is very stuck to all the stereotypes about men wearing galabayas and running with no purpose in the streets with AK-47. And as someone who split his time between DC and the Gulf, I'm telling you, this is absolutely has nothing to do with reality. I don't have to tell you, have you been to Dubai? Dubai right now, in my viewpoint,
Of course.
everyone is a global.
I'm to Abu Dhabi recently, which I was fascinated in what was going on in Abu Dhabi. I went to the Sheikh Zayed Mosque, the Grand Mosque in Abu Dhabi, and all through that passage that leads up to the mosque, I saw posters and paintings talking about pluralism and accommodation and tolerance, which was really really interesting.
Fascinating. So the UAE is right now prioritizing the whole idea of Emirate as a very cosmopolitan society that's global. So they have that slogan, United Global Emirates. So UAE they have a synagogue, they have a Hindu temple, they have the mosque. They are all about open society, and they are a global society. They are, in my viewpoint, one of the most integrated cities globally right now is Dubai. But the UAE story is a bit known to people. Like when you say Dubai, people have an idea what Dubai is. I think the other story that's very important, and I would say it's understudied, is the transformation that's taking place in Saudi Arabia in the last 6 years. I split my time between Saudi Arabia and DC. Saudi is fascinating in terms of the structure changes that are taking place inside the Saudi society. Women driving. I went to 3 art expeditions in the last few days. The states focus on art initiatives, theater, cinema, entertainment, making sure that Saudi is in bar with global standards. We see all this push for transforming Saudi into a tourism hub, into a sports hub. So this is a massive transformation taking place. I think Saudi also is a very important player because it's the biggest Gulf country. It's a country with around more than 30 million people. So they have considerable demographics in the Gulf, massive land, and they're a G20 economy. And they are, in my viewpoint, they're an energy superpower. I would say global economic growth is very tied to Saudi energy policy for a lot and variety of reasons. So I think, back to your point, the Gulf has been going through massive structural transformation on the societal level in the last, specific in the last 10 years, in the case of Saudi Arabia, in the last 20 years in the case of the UAE. And that sort of social transformation is leading to a different sort of foreign policy, a foreign policy that's very critical of legacy relationships and much more focused on agile new relationships that will take their own societies forward. These countries are living in a global moment right now. That's basically my statement.
So, correct me if I'm wrong, you're essentially saying that the old ideas of the Middle East as a bloc and the OIC countries as a bloc, especially the Middle Eastern countries as part of the OIC countries, as a bloc and operating as a bloc, indulging in groupthink, all of this in some ways is a thing of the past. I mean, of course, it can be argued that it was never really true, but to whatever extent it was true in the past, it's not true today. And you're saying each country is charting its own path. Therefore, for instance, each country is realigning or reassessing its own relationships with whichever country that fits its own strategic goals without the baggage of the past, at least trying to do so as far as it's possible and pushing the boundaries. Isn't that what you're saying, essentially?
I agree with this statement and this characterization, and it makes it a bit further. It's not really Arab nationalism anymore. It's more about every country for itself. We're living in a global disorder, and countries have the absolute right to think about their own immediate interest. So that's number one. Number two, within so-called Islamic world, there's also regional rivalries. So you have the Arab states, and then you have the non-Arab Muslim states, which is Turkey, Malaysia, uh, 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 Pakistan, Iran. So there's definitely different interests in play. So it's very hard to group these countries together because they have different national interests and different sphere of interest, strategic spheres of influence as well. So when we see President Sisi in New Delhi and him and Prime Minister Modi making the decision to elevate their relationship to a strategic partnership level, this is a big deal. This is what I'm talking about. This is a reflection of every country thinking about of how should we maximize our national interests and align with countries that have the same values and the same interests as us. When you have India and the UAE are part of two unilateral formats, the I2U2 and the France-India UAE format. I think this is going to be this is the next trend in the region. You're going to see more of this moving forward.
I want to ask you, one of the things that seems interesting is this, of course, this kind of reimagination, of course, has triggered new hopes for peace in the Middle East, especially between Israel and its neighbors, right? Now, how much do you think in all this churn, what importance does the Palestinian issue still have? Or are you saying each country is now assessing it, even the Palestinian issue, separately according to its own strategic interests?
Yeah, it's definitely everything right now is more about national interest. And this is a reflection of the status of the region. The Middle East for the last, I would say, 20 years since the U.S. incubation of Iraq and later the Arab Spring. So they had the Syrian civil war, the Libyan civil war, the situation inside Yemen. It's an unstable region. And with these many crises, you have regional capitals are much more focused on very specific, immediate national interest issues. And that means other transregional issues take a backseat. And this is how we should think about how countries are approaching the Palestinian struggle.
I also want to ask you, you spoke about moving away from traditional ways of thinking. One of the traditional ways of thinking which connects the Middle East, especially Saudi Arabia and UAE, to South Asia, is the amount of money that Pakistan has traditionally received, right, as loans, as dole to help its economy. There does seem to be a bit of change there. It doesn't seem to be receiving that kind of economic support anymore. Would you say that that's correct? And if yes, what's changing there?
I'm not really expert on Arab relations with Pakistan, so hard for me to give you an answer about the level of support that they're receiving right now. Listen, Pakistan is an important country, and the same way Arab Gulf states understand that India has strong relations with Iran, because again, this is India's interest. I think India also should evaluate its own relations with Arab states based on their own merits. I think in this age of multilateralism and global disorder, it's very hard to make it tit for tat for bilateral relations. I think at this point, people are trying to make sure that their alignments are very issue specific rather than having a much more full alignment. Because there's no full alignment. Let's be frank. This is not really the Cold War. This is not really the Eastern Bloc versus the Western Bloc. It's much more complex. And I think countries have very complex network of interest, and it's very hard to see this is going away. So the bottom line is, I think bilateral relations and trilateral relations should be assessed on their own merits, than being measured through a lens of other relations with a third party. That's basically how I think about it right now.
Where does China fit into this entire mix? How do you see China and its role in the Middle East? What kind of moves are happening there?
China is a major player. President Xi was in Saudi Arabia 2 months ago. It's it's a major power, not only in Asia, but on the world stage. It's a massive economic power from industrial standpoint, from technology standpoint, even from some security element standpoint. So China is a major player. Uh, I think the only difference this time is the Gulf has interests also with other nations in Asia that do not have positive views about China, right? I mean, the Gulf has very strong views. The Gulf and Egypt have very good relationship with India, Japan, Korea, Indonesia. So not only good relations with China, but good economic and political and diplomatic relations with other Asian powers who are taking issue with some of the expansionist foreign policy goals for China, specific in the last 10 years. So the question in the Middle East is how you balance out and what's the future? Because let's be frank, and this is what I say here in the Gulf and the Middle East are much more integrated into the Asian economic system than the Western economic system. That's my, and this based on trade, based on people-to-people ties, based on geography. So there's solid structure elements that bring West Asia into the Asian economic system. So what does it mean? It means that in case of a Taiwan contingency, what does it mean for us? And I think this is the question that thinkers and strategists are trying to grapple with, especially because of energy flow and trade flow that might be impacted by a situation in Taiwan. Whatever this situation is, definitely is going to have an impact on trade and energy. And on top of that, and this is what I have been saying and I have been advocating for, people also should start considering thinking about a weak China scenario, right? If the last 40 years were all about the rise of China, and I get it, China is on country was always on the rise, with unstoppable economic growth for the last 30 years, 100%. However, out of caution, people should also consider a weak China scenario and what the options you as a regional power should consider in the case of a weak China scenario in terms of regional choices, international choices, and economic relations.
Fascinating. My final question. You're essentially painting, and you have painted through this entire interview, you've painted a picture of a vastly changing and swiftly changing Middle East. Do you think that we are going to a situation now where the Middle East, as we have known it, will present itself in an absolutely new and completely transformed manner in the next 10 to 20 years, which includes, transforming the economy away from fossil fuel, or as far as possible away from fossil fuel. And of course, in terms of, what kind of politics happens in the Middle East.
Absolutely. I think part of it is I believe there is West Asia. I don't believe in the traditional boundaries and borders of the Middle East. I do believe there is a West Asian system that includes all the states between India and Egypt. This is West Asia from my own strategic thinking. And I do believe that this region is on the rise from economic standpoint, from a geopolitical standpoint, going through a cycle of economic integration and people-to-people ties, and going to make this region much more consequential on the world stage. Because this region is, in my viewpoint, is the middle space between the Indo-Pacific and Europe. This is the region that connects the Eurasian rimland, basically. And I think people should think about it as a navy-based region, as a transoceanic space. And the moment you think about this West Asian system as a transoceanic space, people will be able to comprehend that this is a region that's very fundamental to global economy, to trade, to energy, to manufacturing, to supply chain, to food security. And I think this is why I have very positive view about the region. I think the only risk that I see is always going to be climate change, and the rising level of sea levels. And I do believe prioritizing climate resiliency in the region would be very fundamental to this sort of future successful story.
All right. Wonderful. Thank you very much, Mohammed, for your very insightful comments. I thank you for joining us for this conversation. Thank you.